Hey everyone. So I guess it turns out that reality does exist and water is wet. What do you mean, you ask? Well, those are just things that, like I say, used to be, or what I perceive to be, things that people just understood to be objectively true. That reality exists and that water is wet. But in this modern Orwellian world where the political and the media class constantly attempt to confuse and confound and misinform the people in order to keep them docile, conformist, and incapable of knowing what the hell is truly going on. Or like I've said so many times before, you can try all you want to avoid realities and things that we all know to be true, but denial will not and cannot prevent that reality from existing. And if you put millions and millions of people out of work while also offering free handouts from the government, well, yeah, of course, you're going to experience a tremendous amount of uptake as well as fraud and corruption to take place. And yes, it's going to come from those who are the recipients of CERB, but make no mistake about it, those in big government will benefit as well, because it also makes for a whole lot of bureaucracy. In other words, a make work program for the public sector as well to come in and try to clear up this mess. Headline on the Financial Post, Howard Levitt, false claims are rife as companies and employees take advantage of CERB. Employees are submitting CERB claims when their dismissal or reduction in earnings has little to do with COVID-19. And that's another thing, folks, actually. Listen, when you've got millions of Canadians watching the elitists, the central planners, and those in government in this country, as well as the corporate class, constantly clamoring for big government bailouts to prop them up or reestablish their already failing business models, as well as reckless or irresponsible spending habits, then of course you're going to see that trickle out or down to the rest of society, because the Canadian people aren't really that stupid. Hey, if those at the top or in the 1% or the 0.01% are getting away with gaming the system to the tunes of millions or billions of dollars, then yeah, a few $1,000s a month, well, yeah, of course, a lot of Canadians are looking at, hey, that's just a way to get back or claw back some of that money that government's been stealing from me for years with very little to show or in return. So of course, big government and the way this very socialist country is run these days has incentivized a lot of bad behavior, a lot of corruption, and a lot of fraud. But I mean, come on, what do you expect when it starts at the very top of those who are supposed to be the leaders in this country? Whether you're talking from the corporate, the banking, or the world of big government, they've all been leading by terrible examples, by basically living off of government-forced wealth and income redistribution, or the economic enslavement of entire generations of people. Like I say, this was reported by Howard Levitt, June 19th, 2020. The CBC did an expose last week of a rather sordid situation involving Collier's project leaders in Ottawa. Its chief executive office sent a video to employees exhorting them to give up their paid vacation time and lie about it on their time cards. Citing interviews with employees, reporter Rosa Marchitelli wrote that workers refusing to give up their vacation days were pressured by managers to change their minds and their time cards, receiving frequent calls from higher ups asking if they planned to comply. As one employee advised her, it's not a choice. There's so much fear that if you don't do this, you're going to lose your job. The company responded that it was an attempt to reduce costs after unsuccessfully trying other methods. It's difficult to enumerate the many ways in which this runs afoul of the law. Fundamental to employment standards legislation in all provinces is the obligation of employers to accurately record hours worked, including vacations, and to maintain those records for several years. Also fundamental is the guarantee of a certain number of weeks off with pay each year. Furthermore, rather than taking their vacations one day at a time, employers are required in most provinces, including Ontario, to allow employees to take their vacation in blocks of full weeks. There is a basic employment standard across Canada as employees require vacation time to regenerate and spend quality time with their families. But none of these statutory violations get at the real nub of the problem. Let's imagine if one of these employees later commits an act of dishonesty in the workplace and the employer wants to discharge them. Would not the first and obvious defense be that dishonesty was condoned, in fact insisted upon by their employer? That would not mean that every act of fraud could be countenanced, but Collier's project leader would certainly have a more difficult job in succeeding. That's the problem with dishonesty. Once a person commits one such act, the next 10 become psychologically easier. Such acts are occurring across the land, especially with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit claims. More than 40% of the labor force has received CERB benefits, and there are at least 1 million more CERB recipients than the number of newly unemployed. Most of these claims are not dishonest, as some employees are simply confused. But in the radio shows I now do every week in different Canadian cities, callers are indignant when I inform that they are ineligible for one of the government's multiple programs. Employees are submitting the CERB claims when their dismissal or reduction in earnings has little to do with COVID-19. One small entrepreneurial client had its employees asking to falsely claim that their relatives have also been working for him and were laid off due to COVID-19 in order to fraudulently claim the CERB. Employees dismissed for cause or terminated before the pandemic, or those who requested layoff or leave of absence, refused to return to work, abandoned their jobs, or resigned from their employment due to circumstance unrelated to COVID-19 have all been claiming and receiving the CERB. None are eligible. The fraud is not only on the employee's part. Small employers have been using the wage subsidy to hire friends, relatives, and others while providing them with minimal or no duties as favors to those friends or to obtain free labor. I know of a small employer who is getting a personal loan repaid by putting the debtor on their payroll and paying themselves back through the wage subsidy. Although it's not fraud, the wage subsidy program permits companies to pay employees who are not even working. This should have been so simple. The government could have asked employees to fill out a basic form stating that false submissions would result in prosecution. The form would have these questions. 1. Did you earn over $5,000 in the last year? 2. Did you lose your job or have your wages reduced to $1,000 or less in the specified period as a result of COVID-19? Was this job loss reduction in wages involuntary? That form would likely have ended virtually all abuse. Instead, the government guaranteed false applications by initially making clear that fraudulent claims would not be tracked, and the worst that could happen in the unlikely event it was ever uncovered was that the employee would have to pay back monies unlawfully obtained. Only now, months later, has a tip line been introduced and an announcement made that there could be consequences for abuse. But by now, over 1 million false claims have been filed. Quite apart from the expense, we lack the administrative resources to catch most wrongdoers. As with Collier's, the most fundamental problem is that once employees and employers are permitted to and get away with cheating, they find it that much easier to do so again and again, whether it be in their tax filings or against their employers. Anyways, folks, I'll place a link to this article in the description of the video below. Actually, there's another one as well, a CBC News one with a headline. I'll be adding this one as well. Headline under the Canada section, more Canadians are refusing work due to COVID-19, but it's tough to get authorities to agree. Provincial labor laws on refusing dangerous work are being tested as businesses reopen during pandemic. This one was reported by Inayat Singh, June 22nd, 2020. But I mean, so we're getting, like I say, listen, corruption is rampant in this country, in particular for those who don't function in any market-type forces, right? I mean, those of us in the private sector, even in the private sector where you recognize that there are people who are, corrupt themselves or who would love to take advantage of any kind of scheme where they can benefit themselves at someone else's expense. You know that's going to take place whether you're talking about the public or the private sector. But the beautiful thing about the private sector is because all individuals are held to account by each other, then there's much, much, much less chance of rampant corruption or fraudulent practices to take place. Not to say that they don't exist or that it doesn't happen, but it just can't happen on such a grand scale. Well, not without the help of government, that is, right? Think about all those big government Ponzi schemes or those corporations or the banksters. Once again, that all happened under the watchful eye of big government and all those regulations that are supposed to be in place to prevent these things from happening, right? But when you're talking about the government, in particular, modern governments that have access to basically unrestricted and unfettered printing press, or the ability to economically enslave entire successive generations to pay for the spending that they're currently ramping up, well, like I said, then there's no, how do you hold those kind of people to account? You can't hold people to account when they're the ones that have all the power, monopolize the agents of force and violence, in other words, the enforcers and order followers of the state, and like I say, combined with the power of the printing press. Well, like I say, how does the average Canadian hold these people to account or prevent that kind of corruption or fraud from taking place? Most Canadians recognize that there's no way that they can do so. And when they're watching their neighbor or their friend or someone else making out like bandits, well, yes, you better believe that it emboldens them to say, well, hey, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, right? So once again, leadership from the political or the ruling class or the corporate class in this country or the media class, the leadership, well, you can see what that's doing to the rest of the population of Canada. Fraud and corruption and unethical behavior breeds more fraud, corruption, and unethical behavior. And like I said at the beginning of this video, water is wet and reality exists. It's Canadian Libertarian, and I love liberty.